Hey folks, so we were just talking about, again, citizenship, curriculum, and mass education, and we gotten down to this part right here, speaking of what mass ceremony meant. And literally the idea is as straightforward as discussing ways that people do things that are similar to one another at a similar time in a similar way, simply like you would think of rituals. So, like in a church, people would say perhaps the Lord's Prayer or a typical prayer that would be shared across many denominations and many communities around the world, and that could be considered part of the ceremony. In the same way, education has particular characteristics and particular things that students do and teachers do on a daily basis that are rituals, that are ceremonial, that may not have a functional purpose but are repeated over and over again nonetheless, that are simply sometimes just elements of the functional process of going through school, sitting in desks, listening to teachers, working on worksheets, but all of those are part of a mass ceremony that develops a sense of community. Now, the way that Benedict Anderson lays out his argument is he focuses on print capitalism, which we talked a little bit already with the novels and the newspapers, the introduction of vernacular languages into the official documentation and communication that goes on as part of the day-to-day activities of a nation state. We were talking about, in terms of education, the way that sacred languages had been discarded in favor of more vernacular languages or common languages, or in some cases colonial languages. And we can also talk about the ways that curriculum is increasingly written in languages that are accessible to all, or at least are seen as being central enough to the historical development of a particular community that it would be available to all. Of course, that's debatable when we talk about post-colonial communities, but I think that the rationale that's used is probably similar. He talks about the idea of a national consciousness, which I think we'll get into in a bit, and then how the first models of the nation state developed. Now remember, this vernacularizing thrust of capitalism was, from a historical perspective that Benedict Anderson is taking, is change of, in particular, Latin status as text from being a spoken language, and so that it was divorced from actual communication in many cases. That there was an impact of the Reformation in Western Europe in particular due to print capitalism. And we talked about how that has an effect on the ways that one thinks about community, that we are all looking at readable and shared texts about what's happening or what's going on or what knowledge is valued that's important to curriculum is an important thrust. And then he talks about how the birth of administrative vernaculars, particular languages used for the administration of colonial areas, eroded the sacred imagined community, because these administrative vernaculars then meant that particular communities were professionalized, and that language or terminology that was being used for that profession or that particular administrative area was professionalized as well, and was somehow different from, and in many ways more important than, these sacred imagined communities. And education itself has developed a particular language. We talk about rubrics, we talk about curriculum, we talk about the things that go into that in our large topics of math, science, language, social studies. These are all administrative vernaculars that then create a sense of community that is specific and unique to, in our case, education. I'm going to skip over that one. So he makes this argument, which I won't go into too deeply, when talking about the Americas, that there were Creole communities. These were communities of people that were perhaps mixed race. Perhaps they were part European and part native to the American region. Perhaps they were European in origin, but they had only grown up in the Americas. They'd never actually been back to Western Europe, and so they identified ethnically and culturally with their American communities, and we're talking mostly, in his example, South America. But he says, why was it precisely that Creole communities developed such early conceptions of their nationness well before most of Europe? And I think his examples are really interesting. One is the history that I just briefly explained. One is the isolation factor. Right? They were separate from their European center, from their high dynastic centers, in a way that created a necessity or a need to develop particular vernaculars and particular administrative functions that would be centered on their immediate experiences. And then they were aware that they were sharing those experiences across their sort of isolated islands of colonial outposts. He talks about, I want to skip down to this one, administrative pilgrimages. That there were these pilgrimages of sort that administrative functionaries, like in the Creole community, took, where they were literally trekking towards the center of knowledge, the center of the colonial community, and that they were on that trek, they were bonding with one another as they moved towards the center. So while on the one hand we're talking about the abolishment of these dynastic high centers, we're also talking about the ways that people move towards a common goal that was in many ways keeping them separate from being a part of the high center, but at the same time creating a set of shared experiences and language that they would then bond over and would create a common culture. And again, we can make the association with education and mass education in particular, because it is, as you work through grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as you work through the curriculum in science, math, history, etc., as you go through the educational experience that is formal mass education, it is a pilgrimage of sorts that people encounter, and they move through with compatriots, whether or not they're friends, whether or not they even see each other. They know that there are others who are working through this pilgrimage at the same rate, with the same frustrations, etc. Now, why does this matter for mass education? Well, because models get pirated. He uses this example from the French Revolution. He says, like a vast, shapeless rock worn to a rounded boulder by countless drops of water, the experience of the French Revolution was shaped by millions of printed words into a concept on the printed page and in due course into a model. In the same way, curriculum and the ways that we think about developing community within schools is like this boulder rounded by countless drops of water, because the experience and the content, the knowledge that is valued, is shaped by millions of printed words in that curriculum into a concept that is on the printed page, usually general enough that it can be adapted to local conditions, and in due course that becomes the model. So what is a math curriculum? What is a science curriculum? What is a civics curriculum? What is a whatever curriculum? Gets established into a kind of model that is then pirated because it gains legitimacy. It works in one place, and so it is either copied or it is pushed onto or it is done enough times that it becomes the take it for granted expectation for what a curriculum looks like or how we should think about a particular topic. And he says that this all leads to what he calls official nationalism, which has several components. Compulsory state-controlled education, ta-da. State-organized propaganda that talks about the benefits of being a part of the nation-state. An official rewriting of history to establish that horizontal comradeship that we talked about earlier. Rather than saying that some are greater and some are less, we might highlight those who are important, but often they are important because they helped create the community. Now, in his version of official nationalism, there was a militarism that was involved that had to do with discipline and order. That also could be said to be a part of a state-controlled education system. And that there were public affirmations of dynasty and nation. And this is where we get into the discrepancy between what a nation is and what a dynastic realm is, according to Benedict Anderson. And his argument is that the dynasties actually willingly shifted themselves into being national nations in a way to maintain their power, their dominant status, even though there was a perception of or an expectation for the horizontal comradeship. And if you are someone who wants to think about power imbalances as a way to understand the function of education and the way that educational systems operate, official nationalism is actually a really good way to think about that, because you could think about maybe the curriculum, or maybe the way that schools are organized, or maybe the way that administrative decisions are made within a mass education system as being a function of official nationalism, in that those who are at the top of the heap, those who are from high socioeconomic status backgrounds, those who have positions of power or are part of a subgroup that holds positions of power, for example, in the United States, white men, white middle class men in particular, right? You would be pushing a rhetoric of horizontal comradeship, of equal opportunity and access, while reproducing a system that maintained the privilege of white middle class men over others. So we can ask ourselves, do we find the answers when we're thinking about the overlap between citizenship, curriculum, and mass education? Do we find the answers to these questions that we asked earlier? I would be very interested in some of your thoughts on the discussion board for our class, or in class when we meet the next time. I would like to know how you think maybe some of these ideas about the uses of language, the way that we push for administrative vernaculars, the way that education and the idea of an imagined community of a nation in many ways overlap, or whether or not you think that that is completely the wrong direction to go. I see this as being potential for quite a bit of discussion, so I'm looking forward to that with you later.